So now we're moving on to test and build a collection class. Now, if you're not sure what this is, I'm going to give you a kind of brief overview with a little bit of code. We're not actually going to be building this first of all, of course, because we are doing test-driven development, but I'm going to give you an idea just so you know what we're kind of building. If you're familiar with Laravel, you'll know exactly what this is. So a collection class is just a kind of convenient wrapper for objects or any kind of data that you want to store in a collection. Now, typically we would have a new collection class, and to this what we could do is into the constructor maybe pass a list of user objects. We could pass a list of strings, anything really into this. So you could say something like 1, 2, 3, like so. What you could also then do is use convenient methods like collection count. So this would obviously give you back the value 3. And what you could also do is make this so you can iterate over it. Now, obviously, we can normally only iterate over things like arrays, but in this case, we're going to make this iterable. So we can say something like for each collection as, or in this case, maybe we have a list of users. We could say for each users as user. So we could iterate over this class, which would give us back the ability to go ahead and say something like echo user, and then maybe get their email address or something like that. So that's pretty much what we're going to be testing and then building. So let's go ahead and start to, first of all, before we do anything, write a test for this. So let's create a new file in here. We're going to call this collection test.php. And we still have our user test in here as well. I'm just going to be adding on to these. So feel free if you want to kind of start afresh, get rid of these tests that we already have. So once again, let's just bring over our sample test just so we have the kind of structure in here that we need. And let's change this over to collection test. And of course, get rid of this assertion just in here. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is test that this kind of just works by maybe implementing a get method to grab back all of the items that we've passed into our collection. So this just tends to be how I start things. I'm going to start with my doc block in here for my test. And here I'm going to say that I want an empty instantiated collection to return no items. So returns no items. Now this will just give us a good idea as to how this is going to work. We can define out what kind of methods we want in here, and we can check that when we instantiate a collection and get back some items, there's nothing in there. So it's just kind of how it works as we first use it. So let's go ahead and say that a collection here is a new app, and maybe this would go in some kind of support directory, and we're going to instantiate a new collection. We're not going to pass anything through to here, and we're going to test that using some kind of get method is empty. So we're going to introduce a new assertion, which is assert empty. This will just check if an array or whatever value you give here is empty. And the thing that we're checking is a get method on our collection. So this tells us that when we instantiate this and we maybe add items to it later, we are going to implement a get method. So as always, let's go ahead and run our tests. So there we go. And of course we get a failure because we don't have a collection class. So first thing to do is create the class. So let's create a support directory, and into here, let's create our collection.php file. So let's go ahead and give this a namespace. So app support class of collection, and let's go ahead and just run this test again. So we now know that we need to implement our get method. So let's go ahead and do this like so. And as part of this, we would probably have some items that we would set when we do instantiate this. So I'm just going to return this items, and maybe by default, this property up here is just an empty array. So the idea is then that we have items within our collection, within an array, which we can then use to iterate over when we later implement our iterator aggregate, which we're also going to be testing for as well. So we're going to be pretty much testing everything of this very simple collection class. So let's run our tests again, and we get green. So we know that this is working. We know that an empty collection returns no items. Now we want to test that when we do pass items in, we get a correct count back for the items that we use, that we get back using the get method. So we pass in 3 items. When we call get, the items that are returned are 3, or whatever, however many we pass in. So let's go ahead and define out our test again. And this time, let's go ahead and describe this test as count is correct for items passed in, or whatever you want to call it. Really, it's entirely up to you. Let's go ahead and instantiate a new collection, but this time let's pass some items in. And we would typically pass these in as an array, but we could later on implement something like collection add, and then we could choose to pass in a value, or we could choose to pass in some kind of user model, whatever you wanted to do. So we may not do that. We'll see how we go. So into this array, then we're going to pass in 3 items, and I'm just going to say 1, 2, and 3. So this collection should now have 3 items. And what we want to do is assert that when we maybe call a count method, we get back 3 items. Now we could count how many we get back from get, but we could implement a separate method for that, as a separate test for that as well. So let's for now just say collection, and maybe we want to see a count method in there. So let's go ahead and just run our test. We know that we don't have a count method, so we can go ahead and implement this. Let's do that very quickly now. So count, and just to make this pass, once again, let's just return 3. Go ahead and run this, we get green. Now we can actually refactor. And to do this, we would return count and then this item. So we know that that's an array, and we know that count will work on an array. Now we run our tests again, and it looks like it's failed. So failed, asserting that 0 matches expected 3. Well, of course it's going to fail because we are passing items in, but we're not actually setting them anywhere. So of course we need to bring in our constructor. So let's go ahead and do that next. Bring in our constructor here. And into this, we want an array of items, which we want to then set into that property. So this items, set that to items, run our tests, and it looks like now construct must be the type of array and none given. So it looks like the test that's failing is empty instantiated collection returns no items. So now we have a previous test that's failing because of that. Now, what we wouldn't really want to do in this case is have to always pass in an array. If we were to update our test to account for that, then obviously we get green. But really what we want to do is, since we are kind of looking at this in the way that we could instantiate an empty collection, we want to set this as a default to an array. Run it again, we get green. So we've refactored it and everything's working. So now what happens if we want to test that an actual array that's returned has a count of 3 items? Because at the moment we've just implemented a new count method. Well, in this case, we'll go ahead and create a new test, and let's implement our dot block there if you are doing that. And let's say that items returned match items passed in, or whatever you wanted to say. And we're going to do a similar thing here to this, and then we're going to check that we have a count of 3 on here. So what we could do is say this assert count, and we could give the count 3, and then we could say collection get. So this will automatically grab the count of whatever we get back from this method is, and we're going to check that that's 3. And you could even just modify these if you want to add a little bit of variety to your test. So we could say that the count of this method, which is an array, should return true. Go ahead and run this, and we know that this works. We don't need to write any additional code for this because we've already implemented our get method. Now, because this test is describing that the items returned match the items passed in, then this really doesn't describe what we're doing. What we could do is either implement another assertion to check that both of these values equal the value that we've passed in. So we could say something like assert equals, and then we could say that collection get and maybe the first item equals 1, and then we could create another test here. The second item returned there equals 2. We know that this will pass if we just run that again. So we know now that we're testing that each of these items is equal. Now what you could do is, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, if you wanted to say you wanted to check that a model was set properly, you could check that it was an instance of, say, a user if you were testing that. But since we're unit testing, we're kind of just checking that the value that we've passed in is the same. whether that's a user model or any other kind of model or any other kind of item we're adding to the collection, we know that this is enough to satisfy the fact that whatever we pass in, we're getting back. So you can go ahead and include a slightly more advanced test here, but to be honest, we know that this pretty much works as it should by this test, so I'm happy to leave this as it is. Now, what we're going to do now is check that the collection can be iterated. So we need to kind of think about how this is going to work. The first thing I want to do is check that the collection is an instance of the iterator aggregate. Now, if you're not familiar with an iterator aggregate, this allows us to deal with a class as if it was something that we could iterate on. So before we even touch this, let's write a test for it, and then we'll go back and actually check that we can iterate over anything that we pass in. So we're going to write two tests that deal with the iteration of a collection. So the first test then is going to check if a collection is an instance of iterator aggregate. So we just go ahead and describe this as collection is instance of iterator aggregate. And how do we do this? Well, we can go ahead and new up a collection. We don't need to add any items to this, so I can go ahead and get rid of these items if I want to. And now I'm just going to say this assert instance of, and I'm going to pass in what I want this to be an instance of. And this is iterator aggregate. And we just pull in the full class name, so it has to be the full string to the class. In this case, what you could do is do something like the following if you prefer, but I just like to use a class like this. And then we just pass in what we're checking is an instance of. So basically, the iterator aggregate is just a interface that we implement, which then allows us to implement another method to then be able to iterate over a class. So let's go ahead and run this. We know that it's going to fail, and we can see here failed asserting that our collection object is an instance of iterator aggregate. So we know to make this test pass, we go ahead and we implement iterator aggregate. Go ahead and run our tests. And we get another error. This is because this can't be found under this namespace. We can either do this with a backslash, or at the top we can use iterator aggregate explicitly, and it still looks like it's okay, so this is another problem. What's happened is that the interface that we've defined here, iterator aggregate, requires that we implement a method called getIterator, which goes ahead and then returns a something that we can iterate on. And this is just how this works and how we can iterate over a class. So what we want to do is, in the true TDD fashion, we want to make this pass, but we want to kind of mock this out. So let's go ahead and do this. We know that we need to implement a getIterator method. So let's go ahead and do this. GetIterator. And I'm just going to return an array, and we get green. So we've made it pass. It doesn't do anything useful yet, but we've made it pass. That is the main thing. Now what we can do is refactor this so it does work. But what I'm going to do is implement another test to check that we can actually iterate over this class and get back the result we want. So let's write out the test. Hopefully this makes sense, but if it doesn't, it will start to make sense after we've started to write this test. Let's create a test called collection can be iterated. And once again, a good side note is that we are on green. So once we're on green, we can write more tests, which will potentially fail. Then we can go back and refactor. So it's about writing your test, making it fail because you may not have implemented the functionality if you're using test-driven development, then you make it pass, and you just repeat that cycle again and again and again. Before you know it, you've built up what you need and it's all tested. This is why I love this method of testing. So let's go and create a collection within this test, and all we really want to do is add some items to this and then make sure that when we do a for each loop on this collection object, we actually get the result we want. So let's build up the test. We're going to say 1, 2, 3, and of course you can pass anything you want in there. And let's create a temporary items variable here. Let's do a for each over our collection, which we know is iterable because we've already created a test for that, made that pass. So we're going to say for each collection as item, We're going to go ahead and add that to an items temporary array. And now down here, we can test that the count of this is 3 because we should be able to iterate over it. So let's go ahead and create 2 assertions here. The first one is assert count 3, and we're going to say items because that's now an array with all of them iterated values in. And let's actually leave it at this for now. Go ahead and run our tests, and we should see objects returned by getIterator must be traversable or implement interface iterator. So what we are now doing is, because we kind of mocked this out to make it work because our interface required this, now we can go ahead and actually fix this up. So what we need to do is into this, we need to return a new array iterator like so, and we need to pass in the items that we want to be iterable. In this case, it's this items. Now, if we go ahead and run our test, we will get an error because we see class app support array iterator not found. Go ahead and fix this up. So array iterator, and we get green. This means that when we are iterating over things, we're adding 1, 2, 3 to these items, and we're asserting that that equals 3. If I was to change this over to 2, for example, it says failed asserting that actual size 3 matches the expected size 2. So that is done. But what we could further do is, if we were always expecting this to be an array iterator, we could also check that that was an instance of an array iterator. So let's go ahead and say this assert instance of, specifically checking that this is an array iterator. And what we want to check is collection get iterator. And you might be thinking, well, really, is this observable functionality because this is public? Maybe we could have this as protected. Well, this interface defines out that this should be public. So I'm assuming that someone could call getIterator if they wanted to. So you could specifically call getIterator. So it's observable functionality. It can be used. So we are testing that. So we're checking that when we call getIterator, it definitely returns an array iterator. Let's go ahead and run our tests, and we get green. Brilliant. So why don't we just finish up with one more test just before we move on to the slightly more advanced calculator functionality that we're going to be looking at, which does sound boring, but it's a little bit more interesting than this. And let's say, well, maybe we want to, from a collection, merge in another collection. So we maybe have 2 collection classes that we want to merge one into another. So we can go ahead and write this test out to see how this might look, and then go ahead and implement it. So let's say collection can be merged with another collection. Again, very verbose output here, or very verbose naming here. Let's go and create a collection. So we can just take this down from here, and let's add, say, 1 and 2 like that. And let's go ahead and create another collection. So I'm going to call this collection 1 and collection 2. And this is going to be 3, and maybe we'll say 4 and 5, just so we have a difference in numbers here. So now we can think about how we want this to look. It's really as simple as that. So I'm going to say new collection equals collection 1 merge collection 2. So I'm kind of making up what I want this to look like as I'm writing my test. So I think this is nice. Collection 1 merge collection 2. Now we need to assert that the new collection contains 5 items. So we can go ahead and do this assert count, and we're going to say that this must be 5, and new collection get. What we could also do is a similar thing. We could say assert equals 5, and then we could use the count method if we wanted to. Let's go ahead and run this. We know it's going to fail because we don't have a merge method. So over in our collection, let's go ahead and implement this now. So we know that when we use this, we are expecting another collection to be passed in. Maybe we're not, but we'll go ahead and say that we are. So we're going to say collection, and what we want to do is we want to return. And this is where it starts to get tricky, because really what we want here is the ability to say something like return collection that we've passed in, add, and then adding on the items from this collection. So maybe we'd say return this add collection get. So we're taking the items that we are passing in within that collection, then adding them onto the current one and then returning that. Or we could do something like return new collection, and then we could pass in array merge this get with the collection that we've passed in, getting them items. So let's go ahead and run our test. We see that we get green, so we know that this has worked, but we might later want to refactor this. So we might want to implement an add method to add to the current collection, then go ahead and return that. So in this case, what we're saying is this will always return a new collection, but what we might want is just being able to merge like the following. So we might want to say that we want collection 1, we want to merge collection 2, and then this has a reference to collection 1. So I think that would be better. So I think just doing that, we would want to now say that collection 1 has had them items merged into it. So I think this is a lot better. So I'm changing the test over because I'm thinking about my tests first, and I'm thinking about how I want this to work. First of all, I want to say collection 1 merging collection 2, and collection 1 now has them merged items in. So let's go ahead and run the test. We know that we're going to get a failure here because it's not working in the way that we specified it. So let's go ahead and refactor this so it makes sense. Now in this case, we kind of know that we would want some kind of add method in here, because what we would want to do is say return this add collection get, like so. So what we could either do is create a separate test for get, or we could just add a test on after that. And there's no real hard and fast rules to this. So in this case, what I would do is I would say, well, it's failing because we don't have an add method. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to implement an add method now. So into this, we would do pretty much what we would do with the constructor, and we would pass in a list of items, and then we would say that this items equals array merge, and then we would merge in this items with the items we've passed in. Now we get green. So we know that that's passed. But after this, I'm thinking, actually, I want to create a separate test for add just to make sure that this does work. We kind of know it works, but I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that we don't have a specific test for adding things on to a collection. So I can go ahead and create a new test for this just to kind of be more safe than sorry. And this is just the way I like to do things. So we're going to say can add to existing collection, or whatever you wanted to say. Now in this case, it's pretty simple. We could go ahead and grab a collection here like so, maybe have 2 items in there. And I'm going to go and say collection add, and I'm going to add 1 more item in, so 3. And I'm going to say this assert count 3 for collection count, or rather we would say equals here like so. And then I could add another assertion if I wanted to say assert count 3 and then collection get. So we run this and we get green. So we know that that works as well. So just a little bit of food for thought. When you are test driving development and you're testing beforehand, this made, or the addition of this add method made this pass, but then I went back afterwards, and although I'd already built this add method, I added a test in for it anyway. So really, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's really whatever you feel comfortable with, but generally we are kind of test driving everything. Now that we've done this though, we've pretty much finished up a simple collection class. Of course, you can continue this if you want to carry on playing around. Go ahead and write some more tests for any functionality that you would like to add to this. Maybe you want to add some kind of toJSON method, and actually I think we could do this now. I think this would be quite fun. So let's go ahead and write a quick test. I promise this will be the last one. I know these are really long, but we'll go ahead and do this anyway. So I'm going to say returns JSON encoded items, whatever you want to say. So what I want to do is new up a collection with 2 or 3 items in. It really doesn't matter. And let's make this a little bit more advanced actually. Let's just say that we had in here a user with a username of Alex and a user with a username of Billy. We want to assert, so we're going to say this assert equals, and we're going to say that this should be just a JSON output. So in this case, it would be an array of 2 objects, and in here we would have a username of Alex, and we would have a username of Billy. So we're going to assert this. We'll implement a toJSON method, which will look like collection toJSON, and we'll see what happens. So let's go ahead and run our tests. We know that we don't have a toJSON method, so let's go ahead and implement this now. Public function toJSON, and all we want to do is return JSON encode this item. So that's pretty much all we're doing. Go ahead and run our tests, and we get failure. So let's just take a look at this. And it looks like there's a space in between here. So we're just basically not formatting this properly. So we'll go ahead and get rid of that space. And again, we don't get a pass. So let's just take a look here. And yeah, it looks like there's no spaces whatsoever. So we could just get rid of all of these spaces just to check that. And there we go, we get green. So now what we could also do is, apart from doing this, we could check an internal type. Now there's no real need to do this, but you can, and just to introduce another assertion, we can assert internal type string and then collection to JSON. So we know that that must return a string, and when we run that, we get green. If, for example, we were expecting an array, obviously that would fail, and we see failing asserting that this is of type array. So we can add that in there anyway. I like to just add more assertions than we probably need, but that is a good idea of what you could do. So what we could also do is say, well, when I specifically encode this collection, I want also to return JSON. So I promise this will be the last one, but it is always good to kind of practice this kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and say JSON encoding a collection object returns JSON. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and implement the test. Essentially, all this is when I new up a collection like this, like so, when I encode it, so I'm going to say encoded equals JSON encode, passing in the collection, I expect to see the JSON back. Now, by default, we can't do this with objects, so we're going to look at another interface that we're going to add after this test fails. So I'm going to say this assert equals, and in fact it's exactly the same as this, so we may as well just go ahead and copy that down, and we can do the same for this as well. We can assert the internal type, although it's not entirely necessary. Let's go ahead and check that encoded, so the encoded thing that we have just encoded passes these assertions like so. So let's go ahead and run the test, and we should see a failure. Brilliant. So we're expecting this, but we're actually getting back just a kind of object here as a string. So the reason for this is that we don't have the ability to JSON encode this object. Now there's another interface for this, which I've just brought up here. It's JSON serializable. So if we go ahead and implement this, let's go ahead and run our tests now. We get JSON serializable not found. Okay, fine. We need to go ahead and pull that in. And now we get, it contains, this particular interface contains one abstract method, and that is JSON serialized. So let's create this method like so. There we go. And for this, we basically need to return what we want to be returned when we call JSON encode. So in this case, what we could do is stub it out, but it doesn't really make too much sense, because to stub it out, we would have to pass in an array with all of these items in, which would eventually be encoded. So in this case, I'm just going to return this items, which are then returned. And when we use JSON encode, this will now work. So now we should have made this pass, and we know that that now works. Brilliant. So this ran on a little bit long, but hopefully now that gives you a really good idea of the kind of test that you would write for even very simple functionality. And we're testing pretty much everything here, so we're being really thorough about the test coverage. Now that we've done that though, we're going to move on, because with the unit testing, we need to kind of think about what happens when we have lots of different classes that all interact with each other. How do we even begin to start testing them? And in the next part, we're going to look at testing a calculator class, which has lots of different units, which we can all test, but then we can bring them units together and test them kind of as a whole. So let's go over and do that one next.